When everything around you feels like it's falling apart, when you don't see a way out, when you can't hear God, when even your prayers feel empty, it's easy to think you've been left behind. But what if this isn't the end? What if the chaos you're living through is the very space where God is building something new? This video isn't just encouragement, it's a lifeline for those who are barely holding on. If you've been drowning in fear, disappointment, or silence, keep watching. Because by the end of this, you'll understand not only how to trust God in the dark, but why He never let go of you in the first place. If you're ready, type in the comments, "God is with me," and let this be the moment everything begins to shift. There's a specific kind of fear that settles in when everything you've built begins to crumble. It doesn't scream, it whispers. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. You feel it when your plans fall apart. When the people you counted on disappear. When your prayers feel unanswered. When you look at your life and think, this is not how it was supposed to go. That fear convinces you that you're on your own now, that the ground has collapsed beneath your feet and there's no way to recover. But that fear is lying to you. Because even when your world feels out of control, God isn't shaken. He sees what you can't. He stands where you've never been. And while your hands might be trembling, His are steady. Not for a moment has He left His throne. Not for a second has your situation escaped His sight. You might feel like everything is unraveling, but He's not watching your life fall apart. He's watching it fall into place. And yes, that's hard to believe when you're in the middle of the mess. It's hard to trust when you've been disappointed. It's hard to believe in peace when anxiety has become your normal. It's hard to lean on someone you can't physically see when everything you do see is falling apart. But that's where faith begins, not in the light, but in the darkness. Not in the clarity, but in the chaos. And there is a quiet strength that is born in those moments where you say, I don't understand this, but I will still believe. There's a reason Scripture speaks so often of trust. Because trust isn't passive. It's not a casual nod or an emotional moment. It's a decision. Posture. A daily returning to the truth that God is still God, even when your life feels like a storm with no anchor. Maybe your storm looks like a broken relationship, a lost job, a medical diagnosis, a grief you never expected to carry. Maybe it looks like long nights, shallow breaths, and pretending you're okay when you're falling apart inside. Whatever it is, you don't need to deny the pain to walk in faith. Trust doesn't erase the waves, it anchors you through them. And here's the promise, spoken softly but with weight. This is not the end. Not of your story. Not of your strength. Not of your purpose. If you could see what God was doing beneath the surface, you wouldn't panic, you'd praise. Because while your eyes see delay, God sees preparation. While you count what you lost, He's multiplying what's coming. While you try to fix what broke, He's already redeeming what you didn't even know needed healing. This kind of trust isn't naive, it's holy. It's the trust that says, even here, even now, I believe you're working. Think of Peter. One moment he was walking on water, doing the impossible. The next, he was sinking. Not because the storm got worse, but because his eyes shifted from Jesus to the waves. That's what fear does. It changes what we focus on. But Jesus didn't let him drown. He reached down immediately and lifted him. That's your promise too. You're not out here alone. He hasn't taken His eyes off you, and He never will. Your job is not to control the wind. It's not to make sense of every wave. It's to keep your eyes locked on the one who commands both. So, breathe. Let yourself feel the weight of that truth. God is not waiting for you to figure everything out before He steps in. He's not watching from a distance with folded arms, testing your strength. He's closer than your next breath. Not one tear has gone unnoticed. Not one sleepless night has been wasted. What feels like a collapse is often the beginning of construction, but from a foundation you never saw coming. And you're allowed to grieve what's gone. You're allowed to be tired. But you are not allowed, by heaven's standards, to believe that this is the end. Because the author of your story hasn't finished the chapter yet. He's still writing, still weaving grace into your grief, still turning ashes into beauty, still proving that faith isn't about control, it's about confidence in the one who holds it all. There's a moment in everyone's journey where the noise becomes too loud, the plans unravel, and the path disappears. It's there in that holy interruption that you're faced with a choice. Fight for control or fall into trust. Not blind trust, not careless hope, but anchored trust. Trust rooted in everything God has already done for you. The prayers He's answered, the storms He's stilled, the peace He gave when nothing made sense. This isn't just spiritual theory. It's survival. And it's a different kind of strength, the kind that looks like surrender, but leads to stability. You may not know how this ends, but you do know who walks with you. And that truth alone is enough to get you through today. So take the pressure off your shoulders. You were never meant to carry the weight of an entire future. God didn't ask you to control the outcome. He invited you to walk with Him through it. And when you do, something shifts. Maybe not in your circumstances, but definitely in your spirit. You begin to realize peace isn't the result of answers, it's the result of awareness. Awareness that God is here and He's not leaving. If all you can do today is whisper, "God, I trust you," that's enough. That's a prayer that moves heaven. That's a declaration that makes the enemy nervous. Because trust doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stand. Let this be your reminder. You're not too far off track for God to restore you. You're not too broken for Him to rebuild. You're not too lost to be found. The season you're in might feel like confusion, but it could be the very place where clarity is being formed. The breakdown might actually be the setup. The delay could be divine. The storm might be the classroom where your faith finally becomes unshakable. Hold on. Breathe again. The control you're losing might be the very thing God's been asking you to release, so He can do what only He can. He doesn't need your perfection. He needs your permission. And the moment you give it, even in a whisper, He will meet you there. It's a jarring feeling when everything you depended on begins to fall apart. When the people you leaned on stop showing up. When the career you invested in suddenly dries up. When the routines, the plans, even the prayers feel like they've stopped working. In that space, it's easy to wonder if God has stepped back too. If His silence is confirmation that maybe, just maybe, you've been forgotten. But there's something deeper than feelings. Something truer than your circumstances. And it's this: God's faithfulness doesn't expire when everything else does. We often equate faith with results. If the prayer is answered, God is good. If the door opens, God is faithful. If the path clears, He's with us. But what about when the opposite happens? When no miracle comes? When doors slam shut? When confusion outweighs clarity? In those moments, the true nature of God's faithfulness is revealed, not as a reward for good behavior, but as a steady presence that never leaves. Scripture doesn't promise an easy journey. It promises a faithful guide, someone who walks through the fire with you, who doesn't flinch at your questions, who holds your hand when you have no strength left to hold His. Someone whose character isn't defined by your situation, but by eternal truth. He cannot be unfaithful because He cannot deny who He is. Think of Job, a man who lost everything, his family, his health, his wealth. But in the darkest of valleys, he discovered something most of us miss: that faith isn't proven when life is smooth. It's forged when life breaks. And even when Job screamed into the silence, even when he couldn't feel God's presence, God never left. Not for a second. That's the kind of faithfulness we're talking about. Not conditional, not performance-based, not fragile, but relentless, unchanging, present even when invisible. The challenge is, we often define God's nearness by our emotional climate. When we feel peace, He's here. When we feel chaos, He's not. But that's emotional faith, not spiritual faith. Spiritual faith is what kept Paul praising in prison. It's what kept Ruth walking toward an unknown land. It's what kept Jesus praying in the garden, even when the cross loomed. It's not rooted in ease. It's rooted in covenant. And maybe right now, that's exactly what your soul needs to remember. God's faithfulness doesn't hinge on how strong your belief is today. It doesn't dissolve when you cry out in frustration. It doesn't falter because your hope wavered last night. His love is deeper than your doubt. His promises stretch further than your confusion. And while your mind may be spinning with what's gone wrong, heaven is steady with what's still being made right. Here's something we often overlook. Failure in your plans doesn't mean failure in His purpose. What looks like collapse could actually be realignment. What feels like abandonment might be protection. What feels like delay could be God's mercy, keeping you from running ahead before you're ready. His no today might be his yes tomorrow, but better shaped, better timed, and far more lasting. And when nothing makes sense, his word still does. The Lord is faithful to all his promises and loving toward all he has made. It's not a promise based on your worth. It's based on his nature. That means your current storm doesn't scare him. Your anxiety doesn't exhaust him. Your failed efforts don't surprise him. He's already factored in every misstep, every setback, and still calls you worthy of a future and hope. Sometimes we need to be stripped of everything else in order to see just how faithful he is. Not because he's cruel, but because clarity often requires collapse. When the voices fade, the distractions fall, and the illusions break, that's when we see him for who he really is. And we start to build on something stronger than circumstances. We build on his character. And it's not just about holding on to a distant promise. It's about walking with a present God. A God who doesn't need you to perform, impress, or produce. He needs your surrender. And from that surrender, he brings something unshakable, a peace that survives unanswered prayers, a strength that holds under pressure, a joy that isn't tied to outcomes. It's okay to feel disappointed. It's okay to grieve what didn't go as planned. God's faithfulness doesn't erase your pain. It meets you inside it. He sits with you in the mess. He listens. He weeps with you. And then slowly, faithfully, he begins the work of restoring what was lost, not always with replicas, but with redemption. Because what he rebuilds is always stronger than what was lost. So if you find yourself staring at the wreckage of what once was, trying to piece it back together, hear this. You don't have to rebuild alone. And you don't need all the answers right now. You just need one truth rooted deep in your spirit. He is still here, and he is still faithful. Let that be the anchor that holds you when everything else is let go. Let it be the reason you breathe a little deeper tonight. The reason you sleep instead of spiral. The reason you keep showing up even when nothing has changed. And if your soul is weary, if the weight has stretched long, if anxiety has become louder than faith, there's help. There's hope. There's space for you to begin again with God's peace leading the way. Feeling overwhelmed by everything falling apart? My ebook, Calm Your Heart, was created for moments just like this. It's a gentle, biblical roadmap to walk with God through the unknown, without losing yourself in the process. Inside, you'll find scriptures, prayers, and soul-anchoring truths to help you release fear, realign your thoughts, and return to trust. You don't need to carry the chaos alone. You were made to walk in peace, even when nothing makes sense yet. Find calm in the storm. Rediscover trust. Let your heart breathe again. The link is in the pinned comment. There comes a moment in every believer's life when heaven feels silent. You pray, but the response never comes. You cry, and the silence only deepens. You open your Bible hoping for a clear sign, but the words don't seem to speak the way they once did. There's nothing more disorienting than needing God and hearing nothing. You start to wonder if he's pulled away, if you did something wrong, if your voice got lost in a crowded heaven. But silence is not abandonment. It's a hard truth to accept, especially when everything in you is screaming for direction, for clarity, for a sign. But what if the silence is actually sacred? What if it's not the absence of God's presence, but the fullness of his process? Because sometimes God is the loudest in the quiet, not through booming answers, but through the still shaping of your soul. When God is silent, it doesn't mean he's absent. It means he's working in a way that words can't yet explain. We're used to equating noise with presence. In worship, we feel moved by the music. In community, we feel known through conversation. In answered prayers, we feel affirmed. But faith is not built in fireworks. Faith is built when the lights dim and God says, "Will you trust me anyway?" And here's the truth we avoid. Silence tests the depth of our relationship with him. It's easy to believe when he speaks often. It's easy to trust when confirmation arrives quickly. But when days turn into weeks and weeks into months, and the silence doesn't lift, your faith either crumbles or it roots deeper than ever before. That's where real trust lives. Not in comfort, in mystery. Consider Jesus on the cross. In his final moments, he cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Even the Son felt the silence. Not because the Father had left, but because that silence was the space where the greatest act of love was being accomplished. Redemption was being secured, not loudly, but painfully quietly. And that silence wasn't proof of distance. It was proof of something divine unfolding. The silence you feel may not be punishment, it may be preparation. Some of God's most powerful work happens in what feels like inactivity. Think about seeds. When planted, they disappear beneath the surface. There's no visible movement, no sound, but deep underground, transformation begins. Roots grow, foundations form, and one day, what was hidden breaks through in strength. Your life is no different. The silence might be the soil. The stillness might be the start of something you can't yet see. And that's not just poetic, it's scriptural. Look at the story of Lazarus. His sisters begged Jesus to come. They knew he could heal. But Jesus delayed. He waited. And Lazarus died. To them, Jesus was too late. To them, his silence cost a life. But to Jesus, it was never about being on time. It was about revealing a deeper glory. And in the end, Lazarus didn't just get healed. He got resurrected. The silence wasn't absence, it was set up. So if you're in a season where the voice of God feels distant, you're not forgotten. You're being formed. And formation doesn't always feel holy. It feels frustrating. It feels like you're praying into the void. It feels like worship without response, like questions without answers. But faith that only lives on affirmation is shallow. Faith that survives silence is unshakable. That's the invitation in the silence. Not to panic, but to press in. Not to search harder for signs, but to settle deeper into presence. God's voice may not be loud right now, but his character hasn't changed. His promises are still alive. His spirit is still within you. And that's more than enough to carry you through a season that feels unclear. Sometimes God withholds sound so we can learn the language of trust. It's the same with children. When they're little, parents narrate every move. I'm here. I'm coming. I've got you. But as they grow, the parent steps back, not because they love less, but because they're raising maturity. God does the same. He's not punishing you with silence. He's inviting you into a deeper knowing, one that isn't based on constant confirmation, but on confidence in who he is. That doesn't mean your longing isn't valid. It doesn't mean your questions don't matter. But what if you reframe the silence, not as rejection, but as relationship? What if, instead of asking, why isn't he speaking, you started asking, what is he building in me while I wait? Because something is being built. Quietly, carefully, eternally. The temptation is to fill the silence ourselves, to run to noise, distraction, or counterfeit comfort. But true healing comes when you stay. When you stay in the quiet room. When you keep praying even when it feels like you're talking to the walls. When you worship with no goosebumps. When you believe without backup. And it's there, in the dark and quiet places, that your roots go deeper than emotion, deeper than logic, deeper than control. That's where your soul is grounded, not in feeling God, but in knowing him. You are not alone. You are not being punished. You are being trained. And the silence will not last forever. God is not playing games with your heart. He's not toying with your faith. He's refining you. And when the time is right, the same voice that seemed distant will speak again, clearer, closer, and more powerful than ever before. Until then, don't measure his love by volume. Measure it by consistency. He's never left. He's never stopped loving. And he never will. You might be walking through a quiet season, but you're not walking it without purpose. One day, you'll look back and see that the silence wasn't a void. It was a vessel. It held the groundwork of your endurance, the beginning of your spiritual authority, the deep well of your future strength. And you'll be grateful, not just for the moment God spoke, but for the time he taught you how to listen without needing sound. So keep showing up in faith. Keep walking when it's dark. Keep praying when you're unsure. He is not gone. He's closer than ever. And he's writing a story that will make sense later, even if it doesn't today. Chaos has a way of distorting everything. It blurs lines. It confuses what once felt clear. It makes the strong feel unsure and the hopeful feel forgotten. You wake up feeling like the ground shifted overnight and you're left grasping for something, anything that feels stable. In times like these, the first question that usually rises is, why is this happening? And right behind it, where is God in all of this? The truth is, chaos never surprises heaven. Your storm didn't catch God off guard. The disruption in your plans, the collapse of your safety nets, the unraveling of what you once relied on, he saw it coming long before you did. Not only did he see it, but he made provision for it. That's the paradox of faith. Sometimes what looks like destruction is actually divine construction. What feels like the end might be where something deeper begins. We often mistake order for peace. If life flows smoothly, if routines stay in place, if everything is predictable, we assume God is blessing us. But the God of Scripture does some of his most powerful work in the middle of disorder. Think of Genesis. The world began in chaos, formless, void, dark. But out of that emptiness, God didn't just restore what was missing. He created something entirely new. He didn't panic in the chaos. He spoke into it. And that voice changed everything. Maybe that's what he's doing for you too. Not preventing the chaos, but calling purpose out of it. But let's be honest, when you're in the middle of it, purpose feels far away. All you see are broken pieces, dead ends, closed doors, pain that won't stop, answers that don't come. And yet, behind every tear you've cried, there's a God who's been collecting them, not as evidence of your weakness, but as seeds of a testimony he's not finished writing yet. One of the most dangerous lies chaos tells is that your life is off track, that you missed it, that it's too late, that you're now living outside of God's reach. But that's not how his sovereignty works. God doesn't abandon plans because of detours. He includes them. He weaves them in. The very things you think have derailed your story might be the vehicles through which he brings depth, maturity, and transformation that you never would have chosen, but that you'll never want to trade once you see what comes from it. You may not understand the purpose yet, but you're standing in the process of it. God is not the author of chaos, but he's the master of using it. He doesn't cause every pain, but he refuses to waste any of it. That means the confusion, the heartbreak, the silence, the exhaustion. It's all being used. And it's not just about building your resilience. It's about revealing something far greater, his nearness, his faithfulness, his hand still writing, even when the page feels blank. Look at the story of Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, wrongly imprisoned, forgotten, years of seeming chaos. But through it all, God was positioning him, not just for a throne, but for wisdom, for mercy, for authority that didn't destroy him, but that flowed from humility. Every moment of confusion carried seeds of divine strategy. And Joseph's words, in the end, still echo across time. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. That's not a cliche. That's a lens. One that doesn't deny pain, but demands purpose from it. What if your current chaos isn't a sign that God is distant, but that he's doing something deeper than you've ever experienced? Something that can't be rushed or explained yet, but that will be undeniable in the right season? We don't serve a God who wastes pain. We serve a God who transforms it. Chaos reveals what comfort often hides: your need for dependence, for surrender, for the kind of trust that isn't rooted in outcome, but in character. It brings to the surface every illusion of control, every false anchor, every hidden fear, and in doing so, it makes space for God to rebuild from a pure foundation. It might feel like you're surrounded by confusion, but heaven sees the construction zone of a stronger, wiser, more rooted version of you being formed. Don't curse the place you're in. Don't rush past it. Don't try to tidy it up too quickly. Lean in. Ask God to reveal, not everything, but enough to keep going. Sometimes clarity doesn't come in full paragraphs. Sometimes it shows up as a whisper, keep walking. I'm still here. And sometimes chaos is the only way God can shake loose what's been keeping you stuck. You were never called to live small, hidden by false peace and shallow certainty. The chaos might be a mercy in disguise, pulling down what can't stay so that something holy can be built in its place. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's painful. But it's also sacred. This isn't random. This isn't punishment. This isn't the absence of God's plan. It's the unfolding of it in a way your mind couldn't anticipate, but your spirit will one day recognize as absolutely necessary. You may be in the middle of confusion right now, but clarity is coming. Maybe not in the form of answers, but in the shape of perspective. A new way of seeing, a renewed awareness of who God is, not as a rescuer who fixes everything instantly, but as a redeemer who walks with you through the fire and brings beauty out of ashes, in his time and in his way. So let the chaos do its work. Not to destroy you, but to strip away the noise, to make room for clarity, for real peace, for transformation that's not just about surviving this moment, but becoming who you were always meant to be on the other side of it. Because there is another side, and it's more stable than anything you thought you lost. And when you get there, when the dust settles and the story begins to make sense, you won't just thank God for delivering you from the chaos. You'll thank Him for what He formed in you while it raged. You'll see it all differently. The delay will look like grace, the silence like intimacy, the loss like pruning, the closed doors like redirection, the breakdowns like beginnings. And the chaos, it'll no longer be the thing you feared. It'll be the chapter that changed everything. There are moments when the silence becomes so thick, it feels like distance. You sit with your thoughts, scan the sky for signs, and wonder if heaven has closed its doors. The prayers you once whispered with passion now come out dry. You want to believe He's near, but everything in your life points to the opposite. People walked away. Circumstances shifted. Hope slipped quietly out the back door. And the only sound left is your own heartbeat, unsteady, heavy, alone. But you are not abandoned. That's not a metaphor. It's not a poetic reassurance meant to soften the blow of life's pain. It is a spiritual reality etched into the nature of God Himself. He doesn't abandon. He doesn't retreat when things get hard. He doesn't watch your sorrow from a distance. He steps into it. He moves closer, not further, when the weight of this world tries to crush you. His nearness is not a reward for strong faith. It's a promise for broken hearts. Even when you feel nothing, He is fully present. Your emotions don't determine His proximity. Neither do your failures. Neither does your silence. We tend to believe that if we can't feel God, He must not be here. But that's not how intimacy works. The deepest relationships aren't proven by constant feeling, but by unwavering presence. A friend who doesn't need to say a word, yet you know they're there. God is that friend, that father, that shepherd, the one who walks beside you in the valley even when you can't hear His footsteps. Loneliness has a cruel way of rewriting truth. It tells you you're forgotten, that your pain isn't worth heaven's attention, that you must have messed up too badly this time, that God is disappointed, disconnected, disinterested. But those are not the words of your Father. They're echoes from an enemy who profits from your isolation. Because if you believe you're alone, you stop reaching out. You stop praying. You stop hoping. And that's when darkness takes root. But here's what the enemy can't erase: the truth that God is always irrevocably near. Not just in the light, but in the dark. Not just in the celebration, but in the heartbreak. Not just in the answered prayer, but in the long, quiet wait. He doesn't require your perfection. He responds to your presence. And even when your presence is full of questions, anger, or grief, He doesn't flinch. He stays closer than your breath, nearer than your fear. Think of Hagar, rejected, cast out, alone in the wilderness with her child. No future, no hope. But God met her there, not in a palace, not in a temple, but in the desert. He called her by name, gave her vision, promised her a future. And she called Him the God who sees me. That name still stands, not just for her, but for you. He sees you, not the version you present, not the image others admire. He sees the late-night breakdowns, the confusion, and He sits with you in it. It's okay if your faith feels fragile right now. You don't need perfect belief to access His presence. You don't need polished prayers or consistent strength. All you need is honesty. God draws close to the contrite, to the crushed, to the confused. He doesn't require a clean house before He enters. He walks into your chaos and says, "I'm not going anywhere." That's love. Not the love that comes and goes with performance, but covenant love, steady love. Emmanuel, God with us, even in the silence. Sometimes feeling abandoned is part of the journey, but being abandoned never is. David knew this tension. He cried out in the Psalms, "How long will you hide your face from me?" And yet in the same breath, he declared, "You have never forsaken those who seek you." That is the paradox of faith, learning to hold God's silence in one hand and his promise in the other. Not denying the ache, but refusing to let it be the whole story. You are not forsaken. You may have walked through betrayal, but you are not alone. You may have buried dreams, but you are not forgotten. You may be navigating loss that language can't hold, but you are still held. Not by an idea, not by a feeling, but by a person who wrote himself into your story with blood and breath. And he's still writing. When Jesus hung on the cross, he too cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" He entered that depth of abandonment so you never have to stay there. So even when it feels like God is far, the truth is you're closer to him than you realize, because Jesus made sure the path was clear. No separation, no disconnection, just access, constant access, regardless of your state of mind or the state of your life. God isn't waiting for you to feel him. He's asking you to trust he's already near. And trust doesn't mean pretending everything is okay. It means choosing to believe you're not walking this road alone, even if you can't see who's beside you. It's knowing that your tears are seen, your sighs are heard, and your story is still sacred. The ache in your chest doesn't disqualify you from his love. It draws him closer. So don't give up. Don't pull away. Don't let silence convince you that you've been forgotten. He's there, in the quiet hospital room, in the broken marriage, in the diagnosis, in the lost job, in the goodbye you didn't expect, in the prayer that feels unanswered. In the moment you nearly gave up hope, he was there. And he still is, not only present, but actively working. You may not feel movement, but faith doesn't rely on what you feel. It's rooted in what you know, that the one who promised to never leave you hasn't. Sometimes God doesn't fix the pain right away. Instead, he joins you in it. And that may not be the miracle you were hoping for, but it's the miracle that sustains. The presence that doesn't rush you to heal, but holds you while you're still broken. The presence that speaks peace into chaos without needing to change a thing. That's how close he is. Close enough to hear the prayers you didn't say. Close enough to carry what you can't name. This is not the end. Whatever voice told you that you've been left behind, that your story is over, that your cries don't matter, that voice is not truth. The presence of pain is not the absence of purpose. And the presence of silence is not the absence of God. You are not walking alone. Not now. Not ever. So, breathe. You don't have to climb your way back to God. He's already beside you. In the valley. In the shadow. In the in-between. In the pause. In the not yet. Right where you are. And one day, when the clouds part and the clarity comes, you'll look back and realize that the loneliest chapter was full of divine footsteps. That the silence was holy ground. That the ache was an altar. And that he never, ever left your side. The road doesn't always unfold with clarity. Sometimes, what lies ahead looks nothing like what was spoken over your life. The voices around you may echo uncertainty, and the internal compass you once followed so confidently now seems clouded. It's difficult to walk forward when the visible signs scream contradiction. You try to align what's in front of you with what heaven once whispered, and the gap feels enormous. Still, there is something deeper than your surroundings, something more eternal than circumstance, the assurance of his word. It doesn't change. It doesn't shrink when obstacles rise. And it never returns empty, even when your path feels empty. Too often, we rely on what our eyes can capture. The metrics, the milestones, the moments we can quantify. But spiritual life doesn't always accommodate such measurements. The greatest transformations usually begin in obscurity. Not in platforms, but in private spaces. Not with applause, but in surrender. And often, the most significant seasons of growth come with little to show. That doesn't mean nothing is happening. It simply means what is growing cannot be seen. Much like the root before the bloom, God cultivates foundation long before the fruit appears. When vision falters, memory must lead. Not the memory of what has failed, but the recollection of who has been faithful. There's wisdom in looking back, not to dwell, but to remind your spirit that promises have always preceded fulfillment by time and tension. Consider the desert, the 40 years, the silence between testaments. God has always allowed space between what he declares and what he delivers, not as a tease, but as a sacred interval of preparation. What you see may seem still, but what's unfolding is far from motionless. The mistake we make is assuming that silence equals absence, and that delay equals denial. But some of God's finest work happens in the invisible realm, where eyes can't reach but hearts can be trained. These are the places where trust is sculpted, not by explanation but by experience. Trust forged not through clarity, but through commitment, the kind that chooses to remain even when everything external shouts retreat. And that type of faith, refined in silence and tension, cannot be shaken by visible setbacks. This journey you're on was never about arriving quickly or collecting answers like trophies. It's about becoming steady when everything shakes. It's about anchoring to something immovable when storms toss your expectations. It's about knowing that the voice who spoke into nothing in Genesis is still speaking into the unknown of your life now. And though the canvas may look chaotic, the artist is not confused. The picture is still being painted, step by step, stroke by stroke. What if the unseen is the shelter? What if the delay is the defense? What if the things withheld are not rejection, but protection from arriving prematurely? We crave outcomes we can control, but God is shaping outcomes that can carry weight, outcomes that won't collapse under pressure. The weight isn't punishment, it's pacing. A slower rhythm, yes, but one filled with mercy. One that shapes character before destiny. You've questioned the silence. You've replayed the timing. You've doubted the direction. And yet, here you are still standing, still wondering, still hoping for meaning in the shadows. That itself is proof, not of weakness, but of strength. Because while others may walk away, when the light dims, you've kept going. And that kind of endurance is not born from comfort. It's born from fire. From staying when understanding faded. From choosing hope over closure. From leaning in when you could have numbed out. Your eyes may not witness progress right now, but heaven sees differently. Heaven sees obedience, faithfulness, resilience. These don't always manifest in visible breakthroughs, but they build something stronger than outcomes. A soul that can stand, not only in blessing, but also in uncertainty. That's what He's doing. Building in you a stability that isn't threatened by shadows, but that thrives in them. There's a moment in every journey where vision turns blurry and the road looks foreign. That's where many freeze, paralyzed by a need to understand before they move again. But this walk was never about clarity first. It's about relationship. About walking with the one who sees what you can't, who knows what your eyes can't detect, and who leads you, not with constant visibility, but with unwavering purpose. Every story in Scripture reflects this rhythm. From Abraham to Moses, from Ruth to Mary, not one followed a linear path. Each was marked by detours, doubts, delays. And yet, each one unfolded with divine intentionality. Because the thread wasn't circumstance, it was covenant. God remained, even when they didn't understand. Even when it looked like nothing was happening. Even when others gave up. So let your faith rest not in results, but in relationship. Let it find its footing not in what the situation displays, but in what eternity declares. Because He who spoke purpose over your life is still sustaining it, even when your surroundings argue otherwise. You don't need perfect understanding to walk forward. You need presence. And presence is what He's offering you now. Not answers, not certainty, but Himself. The kind of nearness that doesn't need to explain every delay, because His love fills the space where logic runs out. And when you've anchored to that love, you'll find peace, not after the miracle, but inside the mystery. So take heart, even if the view hasn't changed. You're not stuck, you're being held. Not forgotten, but guided. Not delayed, but developed. And though the steps ahead may still feel hazy, the one walking beside you has never lost sight of where you're going. There are days when the walls close in faster than you can breathe. When time moves forward, but your hope feels stuck. Moments when the weight of disappointment doesn't just knock the wind out of you. It questions everything you thought you knew about God. You find yourself praying words that feel fragile, words that barely hold shape, trying to make sense of why everything is unraveling. Your heart beats with silent ache, wondering if faith still fits inside a life that feels broken. But what if the breaking wasn't the end? What if it was the opening? Every crisis carries within it a hidden doorway, not one of escape, but one of encounter. a threshold where the strength of heaven begins to meet the limits of your own ability. That space, where your resources run dry and your strategies fail, becomes the sacred intersection where God steps in, not as a distant rescuer, but as an intimate redeemer. And not just to fix the external, but to resurrect the internal. To raise courage from despair, vision from rubble, beauty from ashes. We tend to define crisis by what it takes from us. But heaven often defines it by what it reveals in us and what it sets in motion. Think about the moments that marked the greatest transformations in Scripture. They didn't begin in triumph. They were born in tension, in loss, in grief. The Red Sea didn't part until the people had no path left. Fire didn't fall from heaven until the altar was drenched in water. The miracle didn't come until every earthly possibility was exhausted. And it's still that way today. Not because God delays carelessly, but because He moves where surrender makes space. And surrender often shows up disguised as crisis. It's the diagnosis you didn't expect, the relationship that collapsed, the plan that fell through, the future that evaporated overnight. You try to hold everything together with words like trust and faith, but secretly wonder if God's power still applies to you. But that's exactly when His power shows up strongest, not in the polished prayers, but in the broken whispers, not in your flawless theology, but in your desperate honesty. Because divine power isn't reserved for perfect people. It's drawn to surrendered ones. There's a sacred shift that happens when you stop asking for control and start yielding space. When you acknowledge that your strength isn't enough and you don't feel ashamed for it. That's when the supernatural begins to take over. Not as a performance, but as presence. As quiet assurance that you don't have to outrun the storm. You just have to stop resisting the hand that's already reaching through it. Crisis is where we learn that God is not only the God of comfort, He's the God of confrontation. Not harshly, but faithfully. He confronts the lies we've leaned on, the idols we've built around convenience, the illusions we've carried in place of trust. And in that confrontation, He invites us back to the truth that has never stopped being real, that His strength is made perfect not in our clarity, but in our weakness. Power doesn't always look like thunder. Sometimes it looks like peace that holds in chaos, like breath in suffocating places, like endurance you didn't know you had. And it comes not because you've summoned it, but because grace meets you in the lowest places without needing an invitation. God doesn't wait on your perfection to move. He's already moving. Your crisis isn't a detour. It's a divine setup. Not to embarrass you, but to elevate your understanding of who He is. To introduce you to a deeper kind of trust. One that doesn't demand immediate answers, but leans into His heart anyway. One that finds purpose not just in the outcome, but in the process. One that allows pain to become a place of intimacy, not a wall. Look at Gideon. Hiding, uncertain, full of fear. Yet God called him mighty warrior, not because of what Gideon saw in himself, but because of what heaven had already written over him. The crisis around him didn't negate the promise within him. It simply created the conditions where God could show His power through him. You too are not disqualified by your confusion. God often chooses the most unlikely ground to release His greatest glory. Not where the light is already bright, but where shadows fall deepest. Not where certainty reigns, but where questions outnumber answers. That's where power flows. Quietly, relentlessly, faithfully. And when you begin to recognize that power doesn't mean instant resolution, it means unwavering presence, something in your spirit begins to shift. You stop striving to escape the crisis and start listening for the voice inside it. Not the voice of fear, but the whisper that says, "This isn't where it ends. I'm still with you." So let the moment do what it came to do. Wake you up to a greater reality. Not one that denies the pain, but one that reveals the presence that walks beside you through it. There's no shame in feeling overwhelmed. No guilt in being scared. What matters is where you place that fear. And if you hand it over, even trembling, He'll carry what you no longer can. You may feel outnumbered, outmatched, undone, but you are never out of reach. The hand of God doesn't pull back when life falls apart. It moves closer. And it doesn't come empty. It comes filled with power to sustain, to lift, to restore, not only what was lost, but what was always meant to rise in its place. Your tears are not a sign of failure. They're proof you're still in the fight. The power of God doesn't eliminate storms. It anchors you within them. It surrounds you with peace that doesn't require answers. It allows you to walk forward, not because everything is fixed, but because He is faithful. And that's enough. Always has been. This moment might look like ruin, but don't let that be the final word. Let God define it. Let Him write through it. Let Him show you that what feels like breaking is actually birthing strength you never knew was in you. Faith that's more than words. Purpose shaped not by control, but by courage. He doesn't need you to pretend. He wants your truth. So if you're tired, let Him be your rest. If you're empty, let Him fill the space. If you're unsure, let His faithfulness carry you. Not just to the other side, but through it. Because power isn't proven in outcomes. It's revealed in the walk, step by step, with Him beside you, even when the light is low. And one day, you'll look back at this chapter and see it differently. Not just as the season where things collapsed, but as the season where faith was refined, trust was reborn, and the power of God proved itself real in the places that hurt the most. There are thresholds in life where reason no longer carries you, where explanations fall short, predictions fail, and the ground of certainty dissolves beneath your feet. You stand in places where logic once lit the way, and now not even clarity can be found. It's here, in the in-between of not knowing and not being able to fix, that a different voice invites you forward. Not the voice of calculation, but of calling. Not understanding, but trust. This is where faith is born, not in the presence of answers, but in their absence. Faith doesn't compete with intelligence. It transcends it. It isn't the opposite of thought. It's the leap beyond its limitations. Because as far as human reasoning can carry you, it still ends. And what exists beyond it is not chaos, but mystery. And mystery, in the kingdom of God, is not emptiness. It is fullness too vast to be measured by the mind. Faith doesn't ask you to ignore reality. It asks you to trust that there's a greater one unfolding, one orchestrated by God who sees from heights you cannot reach. It's not that logic is useless. It's that it has a boundary. It thrives in systems, patterns, measurable outcomes. But God often moves outside those lines, not to confuse you, but to free you. Because if your trust remains tethered to what you can predict, you'll never learn to walk on the waves. You'll stay near the shore of comfort, missing the deep waters of transformation. Abraham's journey didn't make sense. Neither did Noah's or Mary's or Paul's. At every turning point in Scripture, the pattern is clear. Obedience precedes understanding. They moved not because it was logical, but because it was faithful. And that obedience opened doors that reason alone could never have unlocked. Your own story may have chapters that make no sense right now. Paths you never planned. Losses that seem unjustified. Delays you didn't choose. Maybe you've replayed the steps in your mind, searching for where it went wrong. But what if it didn't go wrong? What if you're standing in a space that defies human logic because it's being shaped by divine purpose? That shift in perspective doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it place. It allows you to hold tension without breaking, to say, I don't understand this, and still whisper, but I trust you. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that anchors you when the tide rages. Faith doesn't remove the storm. It plants you in the middle of it and says, stand here. Don't move, even when it hurts. Even when your eyes can't see the end. The truth is, we often build our peace around understanding. But real peace isn't the product of certainty. It's the result of surrender. And surrender becomes necessary precisely when logic ends. That's where you lay down the need to solve everything and pick up the willingness to walk with God through anything. It's terrifying at first, the letting go, the vulnerability. But something unexpected happens in that release. You begin to breathe again. Not because the questions disappear, but because you've decided they don't need to be answered for God to still be trustworthy. Faith allows you to say, this doesn't make sense, and still, I'll move forward. It allows you to pray when you don't feel heard, to love when you're not loved back, to give when there's nothing left, to forgive when bitterness feels justified, to hope again, not because circumstances have changed, but because your heart has chosen trust over explanation. We all come to moments where we hit the edge of what makes sense. A diagnosis, a betrayal, a loss too deep for words. And in those moments, you will either collapse inward into confusion or lean outward into the arms of God who's already waiting for you there, past the borders of reason. When Jesus invited Peter to walk on water, he didn't wait for calm seas. He called him out in the middle of the storm. Peter didn't step out because it was safe. He stepped out because it was Jesus. That distinction is everything. Faith doesn't make the conditions easier. It just shifts who you focus on. And when your eyes fix on the one who called you, the storm loses its grip. That doesn't mean you won't sink at times. It means that even in the sinking, you're not alone. Faith never promised perfection. It promised presence. The presence of a Savior who reaches out again and again. Every time fear tries to drown your hope. You're not failing when you don't understand. You're not broken because you feel afraid. You're not weak because you ask questions. God is not intimidated by your uncertainty. In fact, He draws close to it because it's there that the truest kind of faith can be formed. Not faith that's polished, but faith that's proven. Not faith that's loud, but faith that's lasting. And when logic ends, that kind of faith takes root. You begin to live by a different rhythm, not one dictated by outcomes, but by obedience. You stop asking, "Does this make sense?" and start asking, "Is He leading me?" That small shift changes everything. You no longer need all the pieces in place to move forward. You simply need to know who goes before you. And when that becomes enough, nothing is impossible. Because what once looked like impossibility now looks like invitation. An invitation to believe again, to walk again, to love again. Not because the world says it's safe, but because you've seen what happens when you trust a God who moves beyond the limits of human strategy. In that space, life becomes more than survival. It becomes sacred. You wake up not trying to control every outcome, but listening for every whisper. You live lighter. You love deeper. You walk freer. And the anxiety that once gripped your chest loses its voice. Not because life is predictable, but because peace has taken residence where pressure used to rule. You were never meant to have it all figured out. You were meant to walk with the one who already does. So if your plans have unraveled and your reasoning has run dry, maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're finally standing where faith begins. There's a quiet pain that comes from believing the best of your life might be behind you. A slow ache that settles in your chest when dreams dissolve, plans derail, and time keeps ticking forward like it forgot your name. You look around at the wreckage of what you thought would be, and fear sneaks in, whispering cruel suggestions. That maybe this is it. That maybe the story has ended. That maybe the pen has stopped moving. But what fear doesn't tell you is this: God has not stopped writing. Surrender doesn't mean defeat. It means release. The act of unclenching your fists and placing the pieces of your life into the hands that molded the universe. It's not passive. It's powerful. Because surrender says, I no longer carry what I can't control. It admits your limit, not in weakness, but in wisdom. And in doing so, it creates space for the author of life to step in and turn the chapter. We hold on to fears because we believe they protect us. If we stay alert, maybe the pain won't catch us off guard again. If we expect disappointment, maybe we won't fall as far. But what actually happens is the opposite. Fear doesn't shield us, it shrinks us. It builds walls that keep out not only pain but healing. It blinds us to what's still possible. It deafens us to the whisper of hope. Letting go of fear is an act of courage. It means staring at your history, the failures, the heartbreaks, the regrets, and saying, you will not dictate what happens next. It means silencing the inner critic that says, you've missed your chance, because God's not bound by time. He's not confined by your mistakes. His grace isn't a limited offer. It's relentless. And His plans are still in motion, even when yours have unraveled. Think of Moses, hidden, exiled, convinced he was disqualified. Yet God called him in the wilderness, not the palace. Called him when fear had become familiar. And that calling didn't erase his past, but it redeemed it. God used the very ground Moses thought was unworthy as the platform for deliverance. That same God looks at your broken places and doesn't turn away. He leans in. We fear what we can't control, what we don't understand, what we've seen fall apart before. But fear isn't a destination, it's a signal. It points us to where trust needs to grow. It reveals the places we've tried to manage alone. And when we bring that fear into the presence of God, something changes. Not always the situation, but our perspective, our posture, our peace. Because in His presence, fear loses authority. Not because it vanishes instantly, but because it no longer rules the room. It becomes background noise to the louder voice of truth, that you are not finished, that your life is not beyond redemption, that the story is still unfolding, and every page is purpose, even the ones filled with silence and sorrow. Sometimes we beg God to erase the painful chapters, but He's not an editor, He's a redeemer. He doesn't cut out the broken pieces. He transforms them. He weaves them into the narrative in ways that will one day leave you breathless. What once felt like the end becomes the very foundation for a new beginning. What once brought shame becomes a well of wisdom for others. You don't have to understand the ending to trust the author. What feels like delay might be development. What looks like failure might be the foundation of your greatest testimony. What seems like loss could be preparation for something deeper than you imagined. God is never wasteful. He gathers the fragments, the prayers you whispered and forgot, the tears you cried in secret, the hopes you buried. He sees them all, and He hasn't discarded a single one. We often measure the value of our story by how polished it looks, but heaven values authenticity over appearance. God isn't interested in a flawless script. He wants your honest surrender. The kind that says, "This is all I have left, and still I give it to you." That offering, as small as it may seem, is sacred, and He honors it every time. Look at Ruth, a widow, a foreigner, someone with no visible future. And yet she kept walking, kept showing up, kept trusting. And through her ordinary obedience, a legacy was born. Jesus Himself came through her line, not despite her pain, but because God rewrote it into purpose. Your life doesn't have to make sense right now for it to still carry meaning. The absence of answers is not the absence of God. The unknown doesn't cancel His promise. And surrender isn't giving up, it's stepping aside so He can move freely, so He can breathe new life into old wounds, so He can write what you never could have imagined. And He's not done. Not with you. Not with your calling. Not with the work He began when you first believed. The enemy may have convinced you that it's too late, that you've wasted too much time. But heaven runs on a different clock, and grace doesn't expire. This moment, yes, even this, is part of the story. And if you can surrender the fear that keeps replaying worst-case scenarios, if you can release the pressure to figure it all out, you may just find that peace was waiting for you all along. Not on the other side of the resolution, but in the center of the surrender. You don't have to be fearless to move forward. You just have to be willing. Willing to say, "I don't know how this ends, but I know who holds the pen." Willing to believe that healing can still happen. That purpose can still be born. That love can still grow in the soil of broken dreams. That the author of your life hasn't stopped writing. He's just turning the page. So take a breath. Loosen your grip. Lay down the fear. Lift your eyes. And remember, your story is not over. In fact, some of the most beautiful parts are still being written. You try to hold everything together, the plans, the people, the responsibilities, the future. You map out every step, prepare for every possibility. Convince yourself that if you can just stay ahead of the chaos, maybe you won't fall apart. And for a while it works. Until something breaks. Until what you couldn't predict forces itself into your life, disrupting every timeline, dismantling every structure. That's when you realize control was never the answer. It was the illusion keeping you from peace. Letting go of control doesn't mean life stops mattering. It means you finally stop carrying the weight you were never built to bear. The burden of outcomes, the pressure of being perfect, the anxiety of trying to manage what belongs to God. You were never designed to orchestrate every moment. You were created to live in communion with the one who holds the universe together with words that never fail and hands that never shake. There's a quiet freedom in realizing that you don't have to be in charge for life to move forward. That your value is not tied to how well you perform, how organized you remain, or how little you mess up. God's sovereignty doesn't depend on your success. He doesn't wait for your schedule to align before He moves. He steps in exactly when you've exhausted your ability to manage, not to shame you, but to show you that His grace works best when your grip loosens. Think of all the moments when control gave way to something greater. The widow who gave her last coin, not knowing where provision would come from. The disciples who left nets and livelihoods behind to follow a voice they barely understood. Paul, blinded and redirected from ambition to assignment. None of these stories unfolded through predictable steps. All of them came alive the moment surrender took the place of strategy. Control feels safe because it offers predictability, but it often comes at the cost of peace. You plan every detail to avoid disappointment, but end up bound to your own expectations. And when life refuses to follow your script, you feel betrayed, not because God failed, but because your plan didn't unfold. That's when his still voice enters, not to scold, but to remind, I've always been writing this story. Let me lead. Sometimes he removes what you were depending on, not to punish you, but to restore your dependency on him. And yes, that loss hurts. The job, the relationship, the goal you held so tightly. You grieve not just what ended, but what it symbolized: control, safety, identity. But grief can be sacred ground, not because it feels good, but because it brings you back to the God who's still there when the rest of it falls away. God never promised you would understand everything, but he did promise he would never leave. And when your plans collapse, his presence becomes clearer. When control slips through your fingers, his strength becomes more real, not theoretical, tangible. In the late night tears, in the unanswered prayers, in the stillness after panic, that's where sovereignty meets surrender. You weren't meant to have it all figured out. That's why he's God and you're not. And that's not an insult, that's relief. Because your shoulders weren't made to carry eternity. Your heart wasn't built to run on pressure. You are not a machine. You are a soul, created to trust something, someone greater than your own capacity. There's a gentleness in how he takes over. He doesn't push his way in. He waits, patiently, until your strength runs out and your heart softens. Until you realize that the fight to control everything has only left you more afraid. That your striving hasn't protected you, it's drained you. And in that moment, when your hands finally open, he moves. Not always with immediate change, but with presence. With a kind of peace that doesn't require clarity, only closeness. That's what makes him different from everything else in this world. He doesn't demand performance before offering peace. He doesn't require your plan before giving provision. He simply asks for your trust, not because he needs it, but because you do. Because peace doesn't come from fixing everything. It comes from knowing that everything doesn't depend on you. This isn't about apathy. It's about alignment. About learning to live under the rhythm of divine timing, rather than rushing through your own. It's about showing up, but not striving. Acting, but not obsessing. Working, but not worshiping the outcome. It's about holding plans with open hands and letting God adjust them without losing your joy. It's okay to plan, but don't idolize the plan. It's okay to dream, but don't put your hope in the dream alone. Root your hope in the one who gave it to you. The one who sees the end from the beginning, who doesn't panic when things fall apart, who already knows how to redeem what feels ruined. You're allowed to feel disappointed when things shift. You're human. But don't mistake disruption for defeat. Sometimes the door closes because what's behind it can't carry your future. Sometimes the detour is the road. Sometimes what you wanted would have stolen what you needed. And only God sees the difference clearly enough to protect you from your own desires. So rest. Not because everything is resolved, but because you're not in control. And that's a good thing. Let his sovereignty be your sanctuary. Let his promises shape your perspective. Let go of what you were never meant to manage alone. And trust that the one who holds the galaxy still holds your heart, even when you're not holding anything together. This is not the end of your stability, it's the beginning of your freedom. There are seasons when the light disappears, not just from the sky, but from within you. Days where even breathing feels like a task. When your strength runs out, your words dry up, and all you can do is sit in the weight of it all. This is the valley. The quiet, aching space between what was and what hasn't yet come. You look around, searching for a glimpse of progress, a whisper of change, but everything remains still. And you wonder if the stillness means you're stuck. But the darkness, though it lingers, does not mean you're abandoned. It means you're being held in the most sacred kind of silence. You don't need to feel strong to be seen by God. You don't have to have clarity to be carried. He doesn't wait for the light to return before he comes close. In fact, he often draws nearer in the night than he ever does in the day. Because the darkness doesn't intimidate him, it's where he does some of his deepest work. When your heart breaks open, his hands move with care. And what you can't see with your eyes, he's already restoring behind the veil. Grief, confusion, exhaustion, they all speak loudly when hope grows quiet. And still, somehow, faith asks you to keep going. Not by pretending the pain isn't real, but by choosing to walk anyway. Even if it's slow. Even if you have to crawl. Even if your prayers sound like silence and your worship feels hollow. God is not measuring your faith by how loud you shout. He's present in the tremble of your breath when all you can say is, "Help me." There's a tenderness in how he meets you there. Not with explanations, but with presence. Not with quick fixes, but with companionship. He doesn't rush you through the valley. He walks with you in it. The silence doesn't mean he's gone. It means he's listening more intently than you realize. He sees the battle you're too tired to explain. He knows the questions you're afraid to ask. And still he stays. You don't need to perform your way out of the dark. You don't need to impress him with strength you don't have. The truth is, the valley doesn't last forever, not because you climb your way out, but because he carries you through. And while you're there, you begin to learn things you can't learn on mountaintops. Like how to hear without noise, how to breathe through brokenness, how to trust when nothing around you feels trustworthy. Maybe you're not here because something went wrong. Maybe you're here because something deep is being made right. The surface may look still, but something in your soul is shifting. Like a seed buried underground, growth is happening invisibly. Roots are digging deeper. Strength is being formed in the silence. And when the time is right, what's been cultivated in secret will bloom in ways you never imagined. You are not forgotten in this season. You are being refined. Sometimes God allows the shadows not to punish you, but to protect you, to hide you from distractions that would have derailed your purpose, to hush the noise so you can hear his voice again, to clear the clutter so the only thing left standing is what can truly carry you forward, trust. Not in your plan, not in people, not in outcomes, but in him, the only constant, the only truth that doesn't bend in the wind. You may be tempted to numb your way through this, to run, escape, pretend it doesn't hurt. But if you stay, if you breathe, if you let the ache teach you, this darkness can become holy ground. Not because the pain is good, but because God is good in the middle of the pain. And he never wastes what wounds you. He never ignores what breaks you. He redeems it all. You don't have to know when the light will return. You just have to believe that it will. And that belief doesn't have to be loud. It can be quiet, fragile. A whisper in the dark that says, "I still believe." That's more than enough. That's where light begins. Not with fireworks, but with flickers. One moment of trust. One breath of surrender. One step forward, even with tears in your eyes. Let yourself rest here. Not in hopelessness, but in the arms of the one who holds you steady. The one who already sees the sunrise you can't imagine yet. The one who's weaving every thread of this sorrow into a tapestry you'll one day see clearly. He's not done with your story. This chapter may be quiet, but it's not the end. Hold on, even if your hands feel weak. Hope doesn't demand perfection. It simply asks you not to let go. So, breathe. Not because it's all fixed, but because you are not alone. And that changes everything. There comes a point in your journey when the question is no longer, why did this happen? But what will I do with it now? You walk through valleys, weathered storms, faced silence that stretched like eternity, and yet somehow you're still here, still breathing, still searching. And that says something powerful about the God who's been holding you, even when you couldn't feel his hands. Every broken moment, every quiet prayer, every surrendered tear has been seen, and not 1 second of your struggle has been wasted. You didn't make it through this season by accident. You've been carried, protected, covered. And whether you noticed it or not, God has been writing something sacred in the pages of your pain. Not a tragedy, but a testimony. A living reminder that what tried to break you couldn't steal your purpose. That beneath the weight of unanswered questions, grace was growing roots. And today, you get to choose. Will you keep carrying what he's already claimed? Or will you finally release it for good? The choice isn't between winning and losing. It's between surrender and striving. You've tried managing every detail, fixing every piece, hiding every fracture. And it left you exhausted, not because you're weak, but because you were never meant to walk this out alone. There's strength in admitting that. There's healing in letting go. And there's peace waiting on the other side of your pride. God never required perfection from you. He asked for trust. Not a loud, flawless, fearless kind, but the raw kind. The shaky yes. The whispered, I'm still here. The honest confession that you don't have the answers, and you're tired of pretending you do. That's where freedom begins. Not with knowing everything, but with trusting the one who does. The storms didn't disqualify you. They deepened you. They shaped a different kind of faith inside you. Not one built on feelings, but one anchored in truth. The kind that says, even if I don't see it, I'll believe anyway. That's what grows when you walk through fire and refuse to stop moving. That's what heaven celebrates, not polish, but persistence. If you've been waiting for a sign, this is it. This is the moment to stop performing, stop striving, stop carrying the weight of a future you were never meant to control. This is where surrender turns into strength, where wounds become wisdom, where uncertainty becomes invitation to rest, to breathe, to trust again. Don't let this just be another message that moves you for a moment and fades by tomorrow. Let it be the beginning of something different, a new rhythm, one that says yes to grace, even when fear tries to return, one that chooses truth over doubt, surrender over control, freedom over pressure. God is not asking you to rebuild everything today. He's asking for your heart, honest, open, imperfect. That's all he needs to begin something new. He's not waiting for your life to look like a finished product. He starts in the rubble. He moves in the dark. He speaks in the silence. And the invitation is still open. Will you let him lead? You've come too far to stop now. You've seen too much to pretend he's not real. The same God who walked with you through this valley will walk you into the next season. But you have to take the step, not with certainty, but with courage. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. There is more ahead, more healing, more clarity, more joy. But you won't find it by clinging to what's fading. You'll find it by opening your hands and saying, have your way. That's when everything shifts, not always around you, but within you. That's when peace floods in. Not because life got easier, but because you finally let go. So what now? What part of your life are you still holding too tightly? Were you afraid to surrender because you're scared of what letting go might mean? Ask yourself honestly, and then give that fear to God. Name it. Hand it over. Let him take it, not because you understand what's next, but because you trust that he does. You were not created to carry it all. You were created to walk with the one who already has. He's not waiting for the perfect version of you to show up. He's been with you the entire time, in the grief, in the fight, in the questions. And he's still speaking now, not with loud commands, but with a gentle invitation. Come closer. You don't have to do this alone. Let this moment be more than words. Let it be your reset, your realignment, your return to the only place where your soul can breathe again. Don't carry what was never yours. Don't build your identity on things that pass away. Anchor yourself in the only one who never changes. His love is still holding. His promises are still true. And his arms are still open. If this spoke to your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this with someone else walking through the dark. Subscribe to the channel so you never walk alone again. And comment below, I'm surrendering it all to God. Let your declaration be the doorway to freedom. Let this not be the end, but the start of everything new. He's still writing, and your story is far from finished.